Well, we heard the gospel of Bon Jovi, but now we're going to hear the gospel of Jesus. This is a story that, I know many of us know so well, and it's just the perfect story for a day such as today. It is the story of the prodigal and his brother and his father. So I thought today I'm going to put it all up on the screen, and if you would like to just follow along as I read, you'd be very welcome to. So reading the entire story. Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am, dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off down the road, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and prepare a banquet. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now, his elder son was in the field. And when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come home, and your father has prepared a feast to welcome him.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working so hard for you, and I've never disobeyed your command, yet you have never given me a banquet to celebrate what I have done. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with bad living, you give him a party.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.' Amen. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, our strength and our light." There he stood, just on the threshold of the door. His hands ran themselves up and down the wood beams on either side, curving over every notch and crack in the wood. But he felt nothing, because he was lost in the thoughts in his head. It had been a few weeks since his son had left. It began with him coming to him asking for money. He said he knew there was a nest egg waiting for him, his inheritance, and he felt he should be able to get it now. He seemed agitated when he asked, but he always seemed agitated, as if waiting for life to act, but suspicious that it wouldn't. His father listened to his request. Something about it didn't seem right. He learned long ago that his youngest son was a mystery, not always to be trusted. His brother called him an accident waiting to happen, and in many ways he was, all impulsive and impatient. But his father always had a hard time saying no to him. He knew when he handed his money over to him later that afternoon that he had perhaps made a big mistake. He knew that because he knew his son, his wonderful, restless son, who never seemed quite happy enough, who always seemed a little lost, even in his own home, even in his own skin. He'd always been like that, even as a child. While his brothers seemed content with whatever life brought his way, he never did. Nothing seemed quite good enough. The farmer and his late wife had always joked that their son was a victim of his own curiosity. Oh, how curious this youngest son had been. Even as a little guy, he was always asking what, when, how, where, as if having the answer to even one of those questions would allow him to calm his spirit even for a bit, ease his mind with the knowledge of knowing something, allow him to release some of that restlessness that seemed to bubble beneath his skin like an underground current leaving ripples on the surface. But none ever did. No answer was ever enough. There was always another question and always another argument when the answer didn't fit how he thought it should. And then there were the temper tantrums. If he didn't get his way, he would let them know. He would let the entire community know. The thing was, he was always trying to escape, even though there was nothing really keeping him trapped. It was as if he was trying to get away from himself, like he was his own greatest enemy, and yet he could never see it. And so he blamed others, he criticized others. His own inner fight became transformed and twisted into an argument with the neighbor or the shopkeeper or the farmhand. The wind of discontent that blew through him became a hurricane that blew from him, sweeping up everyone in its path. People tried to stay out of the young man's way. They respected the father, but could not figure out the son, so they kept their distance. And then there was that day, the day that his mother died so suddenly, leaving the three of them to fend for themselves. The father always thought of that day as the beginning of the end when it came to his youngest son. While the older brothers stepped up to this new painful reality, the younger brother stepped away. He now had a reason for his anger and his frustration. He had a reason, a real reason, to be mad at the world. From that moment on, everything heightened. Everything took on a new urgency. The moods and the outbursts became a regular part of his life, like daily routines on the farm. And taking his mother's death as yet another sign that life was stacked against him, he became even more moody and withdrawn and undisciplined. Nothing was ever good enough. Why was nothing ever good enough? The father continued to stroke the beams of the doorway as his eyes wandered up the road in front of him. He wasn't really surprised it had come to this. He felt it when he handed over the money. His inheritance now in his son's hands, his son had said some pretty harsh things to his dad before he left. Told him he wasn't going to stay in this prison any longer, saying that life was short. He wasn't going to work his hands to the bone, threshing and chopping and pulling and pushing. He was bigger than the farm. He was going places. He had dreams. Father sighed, a deep sigh, as he recalled his son's final words to him. It's nothing personal, Dad. I just can't do this anymore. With a lukewarm handshake, he turned his back. Along the road he went until he was out of sight, never turning back even for a moment, as if the farm was the skin that he'd waited all his life to shed, and now he could. His brothers seemed matter-of-fact of it all. Let him go, Dad. He's no damn good around here anyway. We can hire someone else to do what he did and do it better. In some ways, the older son was right. The farm life had never suited the younger boy. It fit on him like a bad rash. And it created so much tension between the boys, to the point that they barely spoke. Despite sharing the same history, the same blood, the same story, they were worlds apart. There seemed to be sparks flying between them all the time. Now he was gone, there was a peace that settled on the place. His older son seemed more relaxed. Even the shopkeeper down the road seemed to feel it, as a cheeriness seemed to creep up on him, knowing he wouldn't have to deal with that angry young man down the road anymore. But like any hurricane, there may be peace when it finally passes over, but it leaves in its wake so much damage. The father patted the beams of the door lightly, his gaze still on the road. Despite it all, this was still his son. While his older son seemed happy enough to move on, he couldn't. Somewhere out there was his little boy. The boy who used to sit on his knee and play with his beard. The boy who would like nothing better than to go to the fishing hole when the day's work was done and would laugh with abandon while his father threw him in again and again. To give up now would be to give up everything. To abandon hope would to be abandon the little boy that he knew, that he always knew. The little boy who needed the one thing he would not allow himself to need: to be loved. His father always knew that the eye of his son's hurricane was not anger or frustration or hatred or envy. Those were just the storms that spun off from it. But in the eye of the hurricane, the thing that fed everything else, the energy that created the turmoil, was a deep inner loneliness, a hole that no one could seem to fill. A tear came to his father's eye. He knew it was time to leave the threshold of the door, to take his eyes from the road that last held the image of his son. He knew that he couldn't spend all day keeping watch over something that never changed. There were chores to be done. There was life to be gotten at. He smiled at himself because he knew that tomorrow he'd be back there again. Because that's what hope does. It draws you back to the thresholds. It draws you back to places of last contact. It keeps your eyes on the horizon, even when the horizon returns your gaze with a blank stare. But it doesn't matter. You see, when hope is all you have, you cling to it. Against all the odds, you cling to it. You grip it tightly and you let it warm that cold place within, even for a few moments. You let it whisper to you its song, a song that begins with two words: just maybe. Dad, we need to get the corn in this morning. There's rain in those clouds. I know, son, said the father. I'll be right there. One final time, he dragged his hands up and down the wooden beams of the door frame. This time he felt the notch, a hole just big enough to put his finger in. He let his finger pause in it for a moment. Then, giving the beam a pat, he muttered, "See you tomorrow," and turned from the door, from the road, from the horizon, and got back to the day. The story of the prodigal son is Jesus' most famous, well-known parable. It's a story of three men, one who messes up, one who measures up, and the father of them both. We've heard dozens of sermons spoken about the prodigal son. We've heard a handful of sermons talk about the brother. But rarely do we consider the perspective of the third person in that story, the father, the one who had to wait and wonder. A father who, despite his generosity and grace, sometimes gets a bad rap in this story. He's being called naive. The one, some say, who was duped by his son into giving away his fortune. The one taken advantage of. But also arguably the one who had more at stake than anyone else. His heart. He was the one who never gave up hope. I've always thought the story of the prodigal son invites us to ask three important questions about life. Now, don't get me wrong, I can't begin to know the mind of Jesus. But I think that he wanted every person in this story to be considered, their actions or their inactions to be mined for wisdom for today, because each one invites a very important question. For example, the prodigal son, the one who messed up, invites the question, where are the boundaries of life and how far can I push them? A question that probably almost every one of us, maybe most as teenagers, asked of ourselves as we poked and prodded that neat little fence that our parents had established around our lives. His brother, the one who measured up, invites this question: why is life unfair? I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Why can we be good, true, kind, hardworking, loyal, and still get passed over or forgotten? Like a well-manicured lawn that is overlooked, or a perfectly prepared supper pushed away because someone is not hungry. They are both important questions. How far the boundaries of life take us, and why is life unfair? Both offer wisdom as we think about those questions. Both important life questions. But to me, the father of the two boys invites us to ask the most important question of all. One that I think gets overlooked again and again as we rush to focus on the prodigal and his wayward ways, or the older brother and his need for justice and fairness. It's the question that the father invites us to ask: are there limits to love? Now that's a vital question. What I share with you at the beginning, of course, is not actually in the Bible. It's just my interpretation, as I tried to let my mind wander into the mind of the father in the story. The one who watched his son, his own flesh and blood, leave with his money. To wonder what his angst, his worry, his regret, and yet his hope could have felt like, as he watched that road day in and day out, waiting for something to happen, not knowing if it ever would. What is it like to stake your faith and hope into something that could turn out to be an illusion, like phantom mist on a lake at dawn? Who knows if I captured Jesus' vision for what he intended for the story, but it was the vision of how I interpret the story. And that's what a story is meant to do. Not to give us answers, but to reveal questions. And the prodigal son does that in so many ways. Now, I know for some of you maybe here today, and maybe some of you watching online, this might be the first time that you've heard the story of the prodigal son. Others of you, especially if you've come to Northwest for the past 15 years, you've heard this story so many times because it's my favorite story, and I know I talk about it over and over again, mainly because I think it really is the single most profound story in the entire Bible. Simply because it's like an onion. You peel away one level of understanding, you peel away one perspective, one idea, and guess what? There's another one hiding underneath. The story of the prodigal son is like a favorite song that you may hear on the radio. And depending on what mood you're in, it will speak to you in a different way every time. Feeling like you're being treated unjustly by someone? You'll find that storyline in the prodigal son. Screwed up? Wondering what is ahead for you? You will find that storyline in the prodigal son. Have itchy feet, wanderlust, a desire for something more? You will find that story line in the prodigal son. Enjoying a contented life, but wondering why your lazy brother can't get his life together? You'll find that story in the prodigal son. This simple story of loss, love, forgiveness, injustice, and grace is a mirror reflecting back to us some of life's most pressing questions. It invites us to get in the ring with life and to go 9 rounds with some of its most poignant parameters. I believe it's Jesus' greatest masterpiece, painted not in color, but in ideas, inviting us, always inviting us, to stand in front of it and to consider it in a new way or a new light. So as we stand in front of it today, on Father's Day, let's go just a little deeper with the character of the Father as we think of what questions he asks. Mainly, are there limits to love? Before I get there, though, I just want to say this. I always think that this father in the story can't win. His youngest son didn't seem to like him. He took his money and ran away, perhaps hinting at the fact that he perceived his father as a harsh taskmaster. On the other hand, the older son didn't seem to like him much either. Because when the prodigal son returned and was forgiven, the older son saw his dad as kind of naive, as a soft touch. Hard taskmaster or soft touch. If you are a parent or a grandparent of more than one child, you understand this concept. Trying to meet the expectations of your children and what they have of you is a very high calling. Just last week, I went to the drive-thru with my son at McDonald's. And I just happened to ask the young man at the window if I could have a toy with my Big Mac meal. Go through the drive-thru. Jack says, "Dad, I go to school with that kid. Why do you always have to embarrass me?" I said, "Jack, that's my job. That's what I do. I embarrass you." Anyway, the father of the prodigal son was clearly a man caught between the expectations of two boys who were very different. But that's really a side story to what this is really all about. To me, it's a story of love and limits, and how those two ideas play into each other, sometimes reinforcing each other and sometimes challenging each other. Let me explain what I mean. None of us can read the story of the prodigal son and not question the decision that the father made, not only in giving away his inheritance in the first place, but in welcoming his son home with no consequences for his behavior, with no punishment to get the point across to his son that what he did was hurtful and disrespectful and disingenuous, not only to his father, but to his brother. Don't get me wrong, we can love, and we do love, the grace that is showed to the son at the end of the story. We can picture it, the embrace, the kiss, the party, the celebration when he returned because he had been lost. It's a hallmark moment, if there ever was one. But at the same time, can we question the decision that the father made? I think we can. Not only can we, I think we must. If Jesus didn't want us to question the father, he would not have included in the story the brother getting upset and frustrated because his brother got a party. If the older brother had shared his dad's enthusiasm for the brother returning, then we could have included that Jesus' only purpose in the story was to show us the depth of love, the need for forgiveness without consequence. Close the book and be done with it. A nice, warm, fuzzy tale. So the inclusion of the older brother's response is key, because the older brother gives us permission to question the father's decision. And we do. And we think to ourselves, if I was in that position, what would I have done? Would I have extended that extravagant gift of grace, or would I have said, hang on there for a second, buddy? And that, of course, directs us to the bigger question. What are the limits, if any, of love? What happens in the desire to rebuild, recreate, renew a relationship to things like responsibility and accountability? I've always thought that Jesus should have written a sequel to the story of the prodigal son. You know, what happened to him a few weeks, a few months, a few years after he returned to the farm? Did that incredible gift of grace that the father extended to him, did it change his heart? I like to think it did. I like to think it made him a better person, because that's what love should do. It should make us better people. If someone who has every right to figuratively smack us down with their hand for what we did, and instead they open that hand and say, let's try again, that should make an impression on us. I think that should make us more humble, aware, and gracious people, and more willing to extend understanding and compassion to others. Was the prodigal son changed? Or did he go back to his old ways, sulking about the farm, plotting his next getaway, knowing that if his father gave him money once, he'd probably do it again? If Jesus was to return, I know he'd have way better things to do than talk to me, but I would love to ask him, did you ever have a script in your mind for a second part to the story of the prodigal son? Because I want to know what happened to that family. But we don't get to know. So we take the story as it is. We enjoy the happy note that it ends on. But again, stories are not about finding answers as much as they are about struggling with the questions about love and limits. And if you think back on the history of your lifetime, I bet you can relate to the dilemma of the father. Have you had a situation in which you chose punishment or consequence over grace, and you wish you could have that moment back? Or did you ever extend grace and forgiveness to someone only to have it come back and bite you? These are the questions that get to the heart of life. And by the way, if you're looking for answers this morning, you are not getting them from me. I'm only asking questions today, because I want to invite you to really struggle with this. When is there a time for grace? When is there a time for consequence? When do we say, you're forgiven, no strings attached? And when do we say, you're forgiven, but don't come asking me for money again? When do we close our hands and say, not now, not yet? And when do we open them and say, I'm ready, let's try this again? Such valuable questions to consider. Does love have limits? Should love have limits? Or is love meant to be simply the wild west of human emotions, something that we hand out abundantly, extravagantly, generously, with no strings attached, a kind of Woodstock of human emotion? Is life meant to be a great love-in, with no thought to limits or boundaries or consequences? It's a good question. Think about it in terms of your life, but then we can even broaden that out to the world. For example, if Russia were to leave the Ukraine, pull out tomorrow and admit that they should never have been there in the first place, what does the world do? Does the world offer forgiveness and grace, or limits and consequences? No answers, just asking questions. I invite you to really struggle with this on your way home in the car, or maybe later if you're having dinner with somebody. Talk about this. But there is a bigger point to be made here, and I'm going to make it briefly. We can argue all day about whether the father was a hero or a sucker, but the one thing that we can't argue about was the hope of the father of the prodigal son. That's not up for debate, and that's what I was trying to get at in the opening story. We can argue all day about whether love needs boundaries, but hope is a very different bird. Hope is the unshakable belief that if we wait long enough and look hard enough, something we need will appear on the horizon. Something will turn the corner of that road and bring to the threshold of our door what we need. A new beginning, a new vision, whatever it is. I'm convinced that Jesus wanted us to use this story to consider the limits of love, but also to remind us of the limitlessness. Is that a word? Limitlessness of hope. Think about it this way. We don't know how long the prodigal son was gone. The story doesn't tell us. It was enough time for him to blow everything he had and then try to survive as a pig farmer and then finally work his way home. Was it days? Was it weeks? Was it months? Was it years? We don't know. It's speculation. But for the father, it didn't matter. Nothing was going to steal his hope. Nothing was going to dent or damage his faith. Maybe the biggest question of the story is not, is our love big enough, but is our hope big enough? Is our faith big enough? We can question the father's judgment, rightly so, but can we question his hope? Can we question his faith? I'm not so sure about that. We are all standing on a threshold. We are all scanning one horizon or another. We are all gazing at a bend in the road, waiting for something or someone to appear. We are all patiently, or not so patiently, wrapped in some act of anticipation. That's what faith is all about. It's not only about having enough strength to deal with what is, it's having the patience to wait for what can be. God never gave us a schedule for life. Wouldn't it be good if God had? Wouldn't it be nice if we had all been born with a timetable in our hands and we can say, let's get to the doorway because, look, something is scheduled to happen here tomorrow. It's going to be amazing. Wouldn't life be great if it did that? Instead, God says, just keep showing up. Every day, go to that threshold and gaze and wonder and wait. It's this hope that we have, that in time, days, weeks, months, even years, what we need will appear. Maybe in a form that we expect, maybe disguised as a stranger we never imagined. Maybe the question is, how will we receive it? With the skepticism of the older brother, or the grace-filled open hands of the father? Maybe the question that Jesus really wants us to wrestle with is not, does your love have limits, but does your hope? Are you still showing up? Are you still believing? Are you still focused on what could be, not just on what was? Do you have the eyes, the heart, and the faith of the father of the prodigal son, who stood there and stood there and stood there and stood there until one day the rain had finally stopped? "Good thing," said his son. "The fields were getting saturated. At least now they have time to dry up before the next harvest has to be taken in." He was right. His oldest son usually was. He had great instincts when it came to farm life. The father yawned. The day had been long. He felt it would never end. He wasn't getting any younger. He felt the day's work in his bones. Every ache felt like a wound, but also kind of like a trophy, a sign of the old man's persistence and willpower. He should be in bed, but he was drawn again to the door. Rubbing his hands against the door frame, he let his finger rest in that crevice as he peered up and out and along the road. The air was still, as it often is after a storm. Perhaps that's why the stirring of the wheatgrass by the side of the road caught his attention. An animal, he assumed. They tended to come out and drink at the puddles on the side of the road after the rains. He looked at it a moment longer before looking at the sky. The sun was now casting shadows over the farm, a sure and certain sign that it was time to come in. Night was coming. Another day was ready to be put to rest. "I really should get that hole fixed," he thought, as he rubbed the door frame one more time. Then he turned and went back inside. Outside, the wheatgrass rustled again as a young man pulled himself up from the bushes. He had watched the old farmer come to the door. He had studied his face, albeit from a distance, sheltered by the shadows of the bush. It was familiar as his own. He knew the time was now. Taking a deep breath, he cupped his hands to his mouth, and in a loud voice he said, "Dad, I'm home." Amen. I'm now going to invite you to turn around and look at the back wall, and we'll put the screen up for those watching at home, and let us share together this beautiful prayer called the Gift of Words as our benediction. Please join me. Today, may there be peace within. May you trust God that you are exactly where you are meant to be. May you not forget the infinite possibilities that are born of faith. May you use those gifts that you have received and pass on the love that has been given to you. May you be content knowing that you are a child of God. Let this presence settle into your bones and allow your soul the freedom to sing, dance, praise, and love. It is there for each and every one of you. Amen.